Alex Garland is back making another film about war. His follow up to Civil War is a collaboration with Ray Mendoza, who has worked as a stunt coordinator on a couple films, but more importantly, was a part of the mission that the film depicts. The story is of a 2006 mission in the Iraqi War, taking place during the tail end of the Battle of Ramadi. The film follows these soldiers as they set up in a residential area and keep an eye on any local activity they need to be concerned about. This is ultimately a pretty straightforward movie, though one that's interesting to consider, I think. Its biggest strengths, also pretty straightforward. Those would be prosthetics and the sound. They'll just say, it's a war film. There are some injuries. The prosthetics are great at communicating the effect of those injuries. I will circle back around to that in the spoiler section, I think. Then the other main strength is sonic. There's some armed conflict, as you would expect. There's some gunfire. There are some daunting situations, some tension, all that fun stuff. I did watch in IMAX, which I would recommend if you're going to watch. It certainly helps with the impact, and I think specifically the gunfire is excellent. Having the feeling of the gunfire coming from all directions, above, below, or not below, but all directions and above, extremely important for the environment, I think. Different guns have good sound profiles that feel unique, that stick out from each other. There's a lot of variety, and I think that's important for the experience of the gunfire and being, surrounded and in danger, because everything doesn't feel monotonous all around you, right? Like you're getting different sound experiences from different angles. Makes it feel like there are more people in the environment. When the sound needs to hit, it hits. There's one specific moment I'm thinking of that's just a fantastic sound moment where it's supposed to knock you on your feet, and I think it does knock you off your feet, whatever. It's not the only loud and impactful moment of sound, but to me, that's the one that sticks out. The best example of the movie doing its job well. The military operations seem to be executed pretty cleanly to my, untrained eye. There's not a lot of flash in the film, not a lot of flair, but I think that makes sense. We're just dealing with military operations that are supposed to be clean, straightforward. No complaints about performances or anything like that. I think everyone does a solid enough job. It's simply a solid, clean, punchy film. And it's well worth a watch, well worth an IMAX ticket in my estimation. But the discussion doesn't end with simply the events of the film. A film is more than its events. It's also, its ideas, among other things, the meta text. And I do want to be clear, like both of those matter, all of those matter, the execution and what the film says. Certainly in criticism, you can focus on one area or another. They're all there. They are all part of the film. Civil War took a similar approach as this film does in establishing a context, then sort of going to something else, not so much caring about that initial thing it established. It took some amount of heat in general discourse for doing that, especially in online discourse, I suppose, which is perhaps a little more reactionary and other things. Although I don't disagree about the context in Civil War, but whatever. I imagine something similar will happen to a degree, at least with warfare. This will cross over into spoilers at some point, but I'll say when. So the context in the film is the Iraqi War. It says that, I think it's the first thing we see about the film, that it's based on, this moment in the Iraqi War. It's based on the memories of soldiers who took part in this operation. And that's basically it. From that opening, slide, the film just jumps into the operation and to the mission and into the events, and does not specifically mention Iraq, clearly set in the Middle East. So, you can draw your own conclusions. But it is not emphasizing the Iraqi War. It is not emphasizing anything that goes into it, any external considerations besides just what is happening in the moment. So the film is kind of trying to distance itself from the context. It wants to examine war on its own as a human construct, something that people experience. This is not limited to the US soldiers. There are some things that kind of cast some light on the experience of the Iraqi people. It is primarily about the US soldiers. Potential awkwardness arrives because, the film is attaching itself to something political. It's grounding itself in a recent event, relatively recent, I guess, it's been a while now, to which people will, attach various emotions and political stances, right? But I don't want to stop at just that bit of conflict right there, because I think, there could be a tendency to dismiss the film just on that front for not including the context. But the fact is, it does not have to. Not every film has to be approached the same way. The decision to brush past the context is clearly a deliberate one. And I think there is an argument for it that maybe I'm like half on board with. We'll start with spoilers. So I want to consider a couple specific bits of execution when we're thinking about how the context plays into this. First, we have an emphasis on kind of like some quote unquote boring stuff, some mundane stuff. We have things like the soldiers kind of sitting around doing almost nothing or doing tedious, mundane work, like the thankless job of just staring through a sniper scope for hours on end. Even when we get some of these action scenes, there is a clear emphasis on like procedure and orders. Kind of feels like the most mundane version of the military action scene because everything is so like calculated, precise, people are doing what they're supposed to. Second, we have an emphasis on the injuries. And the injuries are interesting because you've certainly seen movies before where the injuries are kind of heroic, where people die heroically, where people suffer heroically. You know, someone's critically wounded and then they gun down the last guy before peacefully dropping dead, whatever. That stuff exists. This film does not do injuries the same way. First, I mentioned the prosthetic earlier, but man, those like freely moving ground beef legs are haunting. Extremely effective visuals that really hit home at just like in a very visceral way, you know, like the impact of what some of these things the soldiers run into can do to them. But you know, it's even more than just deliberately spending time lingering on the injuries. It's the indignity of what these soldiers are going through in their injuries and in their pain. You know, these guys are screaming their lungs out. They're experiencing excruciating pain when they're moved, begging for morphine. They're having their, you know, shattered lower legs caught around corners. You know, even the one guy, if you say this moment like out of context, it sounds kind of goofy, but it's just like the surprise, the indignity of it. Like when that one guy has his penis out for a bit because they're just like checking around the wound trying to find the extent of it, and they just kind of gotta like, you know, expose him in order to try to treat him. It's indignity, and it's something that the film is focusing on. These injuries are not heroic, they're tragic, and they would be humiliating if it wasn't life-threatening. And it's not even just horrific injuries, actually. It's also Will Poulter's character, who just has to cede leadership because he's simply too concussed. He doesn't even have the visible horrific injuries. He's just simply not able to do it. And it's not sexy, it's not heroic, it's just a guy saying, I can't do it, someone else is going to have to do it. It's very mundane. It is, you know, honorable in its own right, being able to admit and be humble that he's, you know, not able to lead, whatever. But it's not sexy. It is the injuries the film shows are not sexy. They are not meant to be inspirational, clearly emphasizing indignity and mundanity in these couple of points. And then it's not even a positive ending when you get down to it for the third point. You know, they walk up to the situation kind of casually, too casually. They take over an apartment building. They get blown up and hung out to dry by military command. They have to beat a hasty retreat after even losing a personnel carrier or whatever the technical term for it is, and several men. They don't even win the point. The Iraqis come out at the end, kind of pat each other on the back, continuing to hold the street. And it may be impossible to make a truly anti-war film, but I think if you walk away from the film thinking it glorifies anything on screen, it just seems to me like someone probably hasn't engaged with it well enough. It's emphasizing all of the least sexy parts and the least honorable parts in a sense, right? Like it even captures them lying to superior officers just to get them out of there. It's about all the imperfections in the American machine and even in the cogs that the machine is composed of in the soldiers. So given like all these focuses on imperfections and stuff that's not glamorous, I would hazard a guess that the film is chiefly aimed at, you know, people who don't view the Iraqi war as like a negative, or perhaps American wars in general. American has certainly gone through plenty of wars. It's time. It's showing that this war specifically is not like, it's not like this grand noble endeavor. If someone viewed the Iraq war positively, then I could see, you know, settling into the movie with this loose context of Iraq immediately conjuring like sort of like heroic American patriotism feelings of some sort. The film then kind of throws away the context and needs to rebuild it from scratch for that person. They see this different vision of it that's brought to their eyes. And then, you know, maybe it has an effect, maybe it doesn't have an effect, who knows. But to me, that's the most likely vision. The most likely reason behind throwing away the context is that perhaps Alex Garland felt that there were enough people who needed it reframed, that you want to introduce it, throw it away, start again. If you're going in, on the other hand, like already opposed to the war, then I think throwing out the context kind of feels bad because, you know, from that viewpoint, the context is already like enough reason to think what the movie eventually arrives at. The film doesn't have to like reform that context, and perhaps arguably what the film ends up with when it's rebuilding that context is not strong enough. And you kind of feel like, well, we started out with the strong point already of the Iraqi war. Why don't we just go with this, depict these things that are more punchy than simply, you know, simply saying war is bad, war is hell, war is bad for soldiers. You know, it's almost like it's creating distrust along the way by building up a potentially weaker context for people. So I do think that, you know, I could see the film reaching its target audience better with this shenanigans with the context. So I'm not really opposed to it, but it still kind of feels a little bit awkward to me. If it wasn't attached to a real story, then I think you'd be a little bit more free to consider what the film is building up on its own without as many directly political implications, I think. That kind of frees you from some of the balance of trying to depict the hellishness of war with the positive depiction of the troops, or at least the gratefulness to the troops, whatever it is. Because I guess to me, the ending sequence with, the slideshow with the real footage and stuff like that, it almost feels like slightly sarcastic in context to me because, we just went through this depiction of the soldiers as being imperfect, of suffering all these indignities and all these trials for a war that's ultimately somewhat pointless, or at least a battle that's somewhat pointless. And then just throw in like yep, thanks though. I don't know. To me, it feels a little bit weird. It's a complex situation and topic, and I don't know what the right way to do it is, but I think I can see the goal, even if it doesn't really hit too hard for me. But I think this is an interesting film, and I've gotten more thought and discussion out of it than I kind of expected to. So I would consider that a success, and I would consider the movie worth watching.